On the day I had my sighting, my girlfriends and I had decided to take a hike up to the fire lookout station atop Shadow Mountain. The hike began from the Grand Lake entrance area. We soon found ourselves wrapping around the lake with Shadow Mountain in full view. In hindsight, I would highly recommend wearing bug spray when walking near the lake. It was something that we did not have that day, and boy did we pay for it. The mosquitoes were absolutely brutal at times as we were close to the water's edge. Once we were clear of the area, we started heading directly towards the mountain itself and its ascending trail. By the time we were midway up the mountain trail, we had already seen a bear and several deer, as well as many chipmunks and what I believe was sort of a mink or something of the sort. Once you are beyond the midway point, the trail becomes quite steep, and there were a lot of trees across the trail that day, which made things quite difficult for us. Nevertheless, we made it about to the top, and we approached the lookout with relief, but we were disappointed. To our dismay, the tower staircase was locked, keeping us from climbing up into it. Basically, it's a fairly short tower made from stone, with painted brown logs forming a deck base on the top, upon which a small hut-like structure is attached to it. So, we sat up there for about an hour or two, enjoying the views from every side of the mountain. It was actually breathtaking, and I would highly recommend it to anyone with a good pair of legs. The trees in this area are predominantly some type of narrow-growing pines, which I believe are spruce. A fair amount of them are dead, which creates a type of screen to the eyes as you are peering about on the trail. We had actually seen bears and deer walking about in this timber screening as we were on our way up to the lookout gas station. It gave the appearance of something walking behind a stockade fence, with every other slat removed. What I'm trying to do here is to set the stage for you visually for what we're about to see on our descent from Shadow Mountain. The three of us had just passed the steepest section as we were making our way down the slope. It was right about that time when my girlfriend, Trisha, said, "Look guys, there's another bear down there." As we all turned our heads to look, I think that Trisha realized at the same time that we all did that this wasn't a bear, but rather a Bigfoot. At first glance, this was an easy mistake to make because of the broken field of vision created by all the dead gray trees. We were quite a bit higher than this creature that was walking through the trees down and away off to our right-hand side. We weren't making any noise other than walking. Otherwise, I'm sure it would have spied us out. But it hadn't. This Bigfoot was on a mission because it didn't stop for a second as it was walking. When we first saw it, I believe we were maybe 300 or 400 feet away from it, and we were able to get some fairly good looks at it as it traversed the slope. The only way it could have seen us would have been to look up and over its left shoulder, which it, thankfully, didn't do. At the place we were on the trail, there was really nowhere to hide, so we just quietly stood our ground and watched. This thing was moving very quickly through the tightly packed pines, and we could see the treetops rocking back and forth as it parted them, making its way through using its arms and hands to clear the path. I would say that most of the trees in here were between, say, 12 and 20 feet tall. The Bigfoot measured up as being pretty damn tall in our estimation. It was an incredible sight to behold, and no, it wasn't a man in a monkey suit. One of the most bothersome things about having a sighting like this is the after effect of how you are received by your peers, having told them of your experience. Speaking for myself, as I was as high as a kite for weeks after the sighting and anxious to tell everyone about what I had seen, but those euphoric feelings soon dwindled away as I saw and heard the reactions of those with whom I spoke. It's really a crying shame that people chose to be so ignorant about these things. However, that's coming from someone's perspective who had just seen one. I'm not sure how I would have reacted had you told me of your experience, but I'd like to think that I would have responded in a better way than most. My friend Anthony and I had planned to spend 5 days backpacking and camping in the Grand Teton National Park. During the course of the first 3 days, we had been working our way into and through a variety of locations within the park. It was on the 4th day that we found ourselves sitting at a higher elevation, overlooking Lake Solitude below us in the valley, with the western slope of Grand Teton facing us in the distance. From our vantage point, which was considerable, both of the slopes descending down to the lake were in view. They were sporadically covered with large swaths of pine trees. This was a vast panoramic view which I am attempting to paint for you for the mind's eye, just so you can better understand what I'm talking about. When you see something in the distance here, it is extremely difficult to judge just how far the distance is. Everything is much further away than it appears, a fact which becomes more than evident once you begin hiking towards what you are seeing. We were perched on this low mountainside overlooking what I just described to you, taking in the view. The two of us each carried a good pair of field glasses, which we had not needed up until the moment Anthony's focus fixated on something below us. He reached into his backpack for his binoculars and raised them to his eyes, not saying a word. As he began to look intently at what appeared to be a very specific location, he told me to grab my binoculars and focus in on what he was looking at. I said to Anthony, "What do you see?" He responded, "Just grab your glasses and look between those two groups of trees right down there to the right." I did as he said and started to scan the area of which he spoke when suddenly I said, "It's a damn Bigfoot." Anthony said to me, "I know, I just wanted to hear what you would say to confirm what I already thought." There was no doubt about it. The two of us now had our lenses fixed clearly on a large black beast walking on two legs in and out of the trees on the slope well below us. The distance could have been very at least a mile or more. However, with the 20 by 50 binoculars, we had an extremely good field of view, which included the Bigfoot and its activities. Now, it's not that I need to explain my somewhat instantaneous response of it being a Bigfoot, but it was painfully obvious what we were seeing. First of all, there's never anyone seen hiking or hunting in these parts dressed from head to toe in black and wearing no shoes or boots. Secondly, there would be under no circumstances anyone in this area without a backpack and supplies, just casually sauntering around in the wilderness. Third, there is literally and figuratively nobody out here, especially where we were. In the 3 days prior, we had sighted a group of 3 individuals that were more than likely half a mile away from us, coming off a ridge that was it, as far as human contact is concerned. As we sat watching the Bigfoot walking through our lenses, it suddenly stopped. As it was facing one of the pines, it began to do something with its arms extended. It was using its hands in a way which made it appear as though it was working or picking at the side of the pine. We watched him do for over a half an hour. Occasionally, we could see the beast crouch or bend down to pick the ground where it appeared to be picking something up that had fallen to the ground. The beast would then follow this action by putting its hand to its face or mouth. I don't need to tell you that this is all distance. We couldn't see any of the details at all. After the creature had spent a considerable amount of time by the side of this tree, it started to move around, in and out of our field of vision. It appeared to be looking at some other trees that were near to it. My recollection is that we had lost sight of it for about 45 minutes when it emerged from the trees and started walking along the slope, heading away from us and toward Lake Solitude. Now, just to settle the score with those who think that people who see such a thing are suffering from some type of delusional disorder, this was like looking at a jet black Frankenstein walking in the middle of nowhere. Even at the distance from which we were watching, the creature walked with the long arm swings and the deliberate lengthy strides. These dramatic movements were more than obvious to the eye, but this thing was not putting on a show for anyone to see. We were more than a mile away watching it from an elevation of well over 1,000 feet or more. It had no idea that it was being watched by anyone or anything. With all the various stories that the two of us and so many others have heard about these things through the years, this sighting had completely sealed the deal for Anthony and I. Bigfoot is in fact the real deal. My wife and I had purchased a house that was listed as for sale by owner in the western Pennsylvania area. It was an all-cash deal with a fast closing. When we went to look at the house, the couple who were living there had a beat-up little shack in the backyard. The main house was so nice that I couldn't believe they had this piece of garbage building in the backyard. It was painted barn red and looked like it had been repaired 10 times over with chewing gum and Band-Aids. It was, however, being actively used by them as a hen house. The access door on the end of the house looked like it was hanging on by a thread. It was held shut by a piece of clothesline that was nailed to the wood on one end and wrapped around a boat cleat on the other. Along one side of this shack, the upper half of the exterior sheathing had been removed, exposing the stud wall. This was covered now in chicken wire that had been stapled in place. The bottom side of this same wall had a hole cut in it for the hens to go in and out. Along the outside edge was a pen made of pressure, treated 4x4 lumber and chicken wire. It was the most ramshack junk box setup I have ever seen. 2 weeks before we closed the deal, they asked my wife and I if we wanted them to leave the chickens for us, to which we replied, "No, thank you," and we left it at that. At the closing table in the attorney's office, we had asked them during some small talk how they made out in the removal of the chickens. John, the husband, said, "Thank God we got rid of them at the last minute, only yesterday afternoon." The following day, my wife and I were over the painting of the interior of the house. My friend Lou was preparing the bathroom for a new tile job. Less than 6 days later, we had moved in. It was on the evening of April 26, 2015, 3 days after we had moved in, that all hell had broke loose. I remember the exact date because we had just celebrated my wife's first birthday in the new home on the 25th. During the last stages of twilight, after the sun had already set for the day, I stepped out of the back door onto the patio, having just come home from work. All the following signs that I am about to say to you virtually happened at the same time. As I stepped out of the back door, my eyes were immediately drawn to the rope lock on the hen house. It was unraveled, leaving the door open on the now empty coop. As I was looking at this open door, I had pulled the door shut hard behind me, quite loudly when, without warning, a Bigfoot launched outward from inside of the coop. He jumped out in what I would call a Superman leap, straight through the chicken wire which was now wrapped around him as he landed on the ground. He was gigantic and came flying out in full force, completely horizontal to the ground, landing on all fours, maybe 25 feet from the coop. With one swift movement, he stood to his feet, flinging both of his arms into the air, throwing the wire off his body. He turned, snarled at me, and then he literally launched himself into the woods behind our home in what was maybe 3 consecutive leaps. I wouldn't call them steps because the amount of ground he had covered in these 3 movements of his legs were insane. All this had happened so quickly that I didn't even have time to think about what was unfolding before my very own eyes. It momentarily felt like my heart had stopped and I wasn't breathing. If he had wanted to get me, I would have been dead meat for sure. But it seemed like I had surprised the monster and it just wanted to get the heck out of our yard. I have never in my life been that close to anything remotely as large as this thing was. It became immediately obvious to me that it was familiar with the smell and location of this house, which did, by the way, stink like chicken shit, and I was left wondering if it hadn't been here before. When he stood up in front of me, he looked like one giant cube of animal. It reminded me of the old Hulk TV show when Bill What's-His-Name transformed into the monster. The Bigfoot was totally ripped up in every sense of the word, being just muscle upon muscle. He had the most evil-looking facial grimace that you could ever imagine. When he growled at me, his upper lip something receded as he showed me his teeth. As he did this, his facial skin kind of scrunched up, forming a large layer of wrinkles up to his eyes, which were completely black. I could see that the underlying skin was a dark gray in color. Initially, I had thought that he was completely covered in hair, but he was not. He did have somewhat of what I would call a beard, and there was actually quite a bit of hair on his face, with the exception of the area on both sides of his nose. To me, his ears seemed too small for his head, and they were flushed to the sides as well. Now, my wife, who works in a local hospital until 11 p.m., could not believe what I told her when she came home. Quite frankly, who could blame her? It was the craziest and most frightening event of my life to date, and I hope that I never have to endure it again. Chloe and I had been out for a day hike in the Glacier National when we found ourselves approaching the McDonald Creek footbridge. Now, why they call this a creek is beyond me, because actually it's quite wide and there is white water in every direction that you look. Chloe and I were standing in the middle of the bridge, taking in the sights and sounds of the creek and absorbing the beauty of the day. We must have been standing there for about a half an hour when we decided to continue our little trek, crossing over the remainder of the bridge and making our way into the trail. As you cross over the bridge, the trail continues along the lower side of what I would call a small mountain, which is covered in pines that continue up the sides of its steep slope. We were just breaking into the trail, having crossed the footbridge, when Chloe said to me, "Ed, what is that over there?" As my eyes became fixed on where she was now pointing, I could see a large fur-covered creature peering out from behind a tree only, maybe 50 feet or so away from us. This creature was at least 4 or 5 times wider than the tree it was hiding behind, and it kept moving its head behind and then away from the tree, looking directly at us when it did. It was enormous in stature, and Chloe had grabbed my arm in fear. As soon as I saw it, I knew that I was looking at a Bigfoot. It was repeating this movement of going behind the tree and then looking back at us so quickly that it was hard to keep track of how many times it had actually occurred. The tree it was standing behind was no more than, say, 14 inches wide, and there was at least a foot or more of its body visible on both sides. In the moment, I remember thinking that it must have been watching us on the bridge, and perhaps we caught it off guard as we quickly resumed our hike going into the direction it was standing. At any rate, it seemed very nervous, which was something I was not happy about. If it had decided to come at us and do us harm, there would have been little or nothing that we could have done to defend ourselves against it. It was all of 8 or 9 feet tall and extremely broad. Each time that it tilted or leaned away from the tree, its left hand remained on the side of the trunk while the rest of the body came into view. Its mouth was shut the entire time, and it didn't make as much as it sounded. The face was very flat as far as we could see, and its expression was very mean or evil looking, although it wasn't exhibiting any behavior to match its appearance. What I just described to you was going on for maybe a minute when it turned and started to move up the slope on an angle going away from us. This was a very steep incline that was densely packed with trees, yet each of the steps it took appeared to be something like 10 feet long. The Bigfoot was totally out of our sight in about 5 strides, having covered some 40 or 50 feet into the trees. We could hear some crunching noises for maybe another 30 seconds, and then there was nothing. My wife and I immediately retreated back over the bridge and hightailed it out of there. Chloe was visibly shaking, and I guess I was in somewhat of a state of shock myself. I remember I was breathing very shallowly and was having trouble gathering my thoughts about what had just occurred. As far as what this Bigfoot looked like, as I just said, at the waist alone it was at least 3 to 4 feet wide, and then its body tapered outward from there. I would have to estimate that at the outside edges of its shoulders, we are talking at the very least 6 to 7 feet or so. It was absolutely staggering to the eyes. Its face was mostly covered in hair, with the exception being around and just below its eyes, as well as part of the cheek area. Its fingers that were wrapped around the tree's trunk were very long, perhaps almost a foot in length. What we would call the pectoral muscles made it appear like there were 2 bed pillows plastered to its upper chest. The thickness of its biceps were at least 10 inches or more, and when it stepped away from us, I could see the bottoms of its feet briefly on, maybe 2 of the steps that it had taken. From my perspective, they appeared to be gray and somewhat flat, like the sole of a well-worn shoe. I distinctly remember the nose being extremely broad and flat to the face, which made the lower jaw seem to protrude abnormally from the face. My hope is that I have done a good job in reporting this sighting to you and your readers. Having said as much, mere words cannot describe and will never take the place of having the encounter for yourself. It was a combination of total fear and total ecstasy at the same time, kind of like finding a pot of gold that could kill you. I am more or less an amateur photographer, specializing in landscape and panoramic pictures. I don't know when or how someone is touted to be a professional in my craft, but I have never applied that badge to myself. I have been at this now for well over 25 years, and many of my pictures are posted online at sites such as Flickr. My wife, Sandra, and I were just coming off some high ground, working our way down and through lower crab meadows. I had just set the tripod up with the view of the valley and the trees within the meadows in the foreground, and with Mount Russell rising up in the background. Having taken a few really nice shots from this perspective, the two of us continued to hike through the crab, as we call it. As we made our way through, we had decided to work our way up to a slightly higher position on one of the wooded hilltops to our left side. We had hiked up through the trees to a slightly higher elevation where the perspective through the lens had changed dramatically. Once again, I had set up the tripod to take a few more shots. The view from here was spectacular. I was standing alongside of the camera setting up for a panoramic shot when a loud knocking sound emanated through the valley. Sandra and I both looked at each other as if to say, "What the heck was that?" We began to scan the surrounding area in hopes of seeing whatever had made the sound. I should mention that we hadn't seen any large animals as we passed through the crab, getting to the point where we found ourselves. I was using the telephoto camera lens, and Sandra was using a pair of field glasses to scan the entire area around us. After a few more moments, having heard nothing more, my wife said she saw something dark pacing around in the timber on the slope to our right-hand side. I said to her, "What do you mean, pacing?" She said to me that whatever she was looking at was standing on two legs and was moving back and forth in a random manner within the trees. I immediately started scanning the area in which she was looking with my telephoto, and bingo! There, before my eyes, was a large black Bigfoot on the slope. Just so you can visualize what I was seeing through the lens, the creature was about 2 inches tall in the lens at this distance. I had it in focus though, but I couldn't see it or its movements with great clarity. It was pacing around, exactly as my wife had said, flipping its arms left and right, like a nervous man waiting for a late bus. It stayed in this one small area, pacing around for maybe 10 minutes or so. Suddenly, it stopped pacing and stood erect, facing the north with its head held high, and brought its hands up to its mouth. We once again heard a loud, resonating knock. As soon as we heard the knocking sound, it lowered its arms and started pacing around, as it had been doing before. Now, I must be upfront with you, and whatnot. My wife and I have seen every Bigfoot show available to mankind 10 times and over. We had heard all these tales and seen all the people pounding on trees with logs and bats walking through the forest. The two of us, in all of our outdoor adventures, have seen and heard nothing for ourselves up until this afternoon of which I speak. On that afternoon, I believe we settled the score once and for all. As far as wood knocks go, it is not a wood knock at all, but rather a large and loud vocalization being made by the creatures internally. Having tried it for myself, I can make a cluck or knock sound by putting my tongue to the roof of my mouth and moving my jaw downward. There is no way for me to describe the mechanics of what I am talking about to you, but I can do it. Whether or not they are doing it in the same way as something which you and I have no way of knowing. But what I saw and heard was evidence enough for me. There was nothing else present in the valley with us, and the sound occurred exactly when it had elevated its head and put its hands to the sides of its mouth. The creature was evidently very tall and broad in stature. Exactly how big I cannot say, because the distance was far too great and we weren't going over there to say hello. We could most definitely make out the exceedingly long arm length, and its fur or hair was shiny and black. After about what must have been 20 or so minutes, it abruptly stopped this pacing and moved out of our sight, walking what I would say was some 300 or 400 yards. I, as a photographer, have captured some moments in time that will never be duplicated again. I have shown the same stills to many others that you have seen, and they frankly don't believe it or have little or nothing to say about them. I guess it's just part of human nature. We have the believers and the non-believers. We have those who do and those who don't. As for Sandra and myself, we are most definitely now counted among the believers. It was in June of 2011 that Lyle and I were stretching our legs on the shoreline about 20 miles south of Cape Flattery and maybe 10 miles due east of the Olympic National Park. You can get very close to the shore here via the highway, and we were hiking below a short bluff, which is inclusive of a protective narrow band of wildlife management zone. The time of day was roughly 7:30 in the morning when we began our hike. There is a large stretch of shoreline consisting of many miles which Lyle and I regularly hike at different points and times of the year. Lyle is an artist and comes here to collect driftwood to use in his sculptures. We were hugging the bluff, scavenging through the debris from high tide, looking for some good finds, when we were just approaching a bend in the bluff to our left. Once around this bend, a long stretch of beach comes into view, which extends for many miles to the south. As soon as our eyes were clear of the bluff, we could see two large, darkly colored figures moving around a large mass lying on the shore. One of the figures was standing and the other appeared to be down on the ground, moving around. From the distance, it looked like it may have been two men wearing coveralls or even foul weather gear. So we continued heading in their direction. I don't think we walked another 100 feet when the guy on the ground stood up and the man who was standing turned around quickly to look in our direction. No sooner had this happened than the two of them took off, scurrying up the side of the bluff and out of sight. The whole entire thing was very bizarre as it unfolded before my eyes. As weird as all this may sound to you, picture us walking down this lonely stretch of shore and having this occur before your very own eyes. We continued to walk down to where they had been, and as we got closer, we could see now that the mass on the beach was, in fact, a dead juvenile gray whale. The whale was obviously dead and had enormous wounds on its sides. To us, it appeared to be the result of what may have been a great white, or perhaps a killer whale at most. It appeared to have died and washed up on the beach before being eaten. I now realize, standing over the whale, that what I was seeing from the distance was one guy holding up the upper jaw of the whale, and the other guy was on the ground doing something within the mouth area of the whale. There was a lot of meat, for lack of a better word, and this debris laying around the mouth of this whale on the beach. It seemed as though they had been going through the mouth to harvest the interior of the whale. As we stood there, taking this all in and trying to make sense of it, our eyes now turned to the bluff where the figures had exited. It was fairly tall and steep, and we could see where they had climbed up it. We looked it over and determined that neither of us thought we could scale it all, let alone at a fast pace. These two guys had made it up in just a matter of seconds. Moving closer to the bluff's base, our eyes were open to what we had been seeing. There were several very large, well-made bare footprints at the base of the bluff. They were similar to a human's, but extremely large and broad in nature. The two of us, not being ignorant, now realized we had just seen two Bigfoots scavenging a whale carcass and making a hasty exit up the bluff. With the Olympic National Park and forest being in reasonable close proximity to our location, and the fact of the matter being that there is nothing around here to speak of to begin with, we now knew that they were in the area. The picture had now come together as to what we were seeing. I know, speaking for myself, that I was thinking, what the heck are two guys doing out here in black fisherman's rain gear? And even if they were coveralls, they would be inappropriate for the day's conditions, which were very mild at most. I did notice that as they started to run, their movements looked very strange. Their steps and arm swings looked disproportionate in comparison to what we were used to seeing from a human perspective. Now we know the reason why. We had just seen two Bigfoot on the shore. I feel it would be good to lay down a little groundwork as to who I am and what I do. It may help to add credence to what I'm about to say to both you and everybody out there listening. First of all, I'm a third-generation grocer and now food wholesaler. This business, which I now run and own, was started as a grocery store in New York in 1905. Today, having taken over the business many years ago from my father, We are strictly a wholesale vegetable distributor to the restaurant and food service industry, predominantly in New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. I have a great managerial and employee base that affords me a surplus of free time, with me being able to accomplish most of what I do via phone and internet. Since I don't really need to be there, except for the occasional fly-in, I have lived in numerous locations throughout the country over the past 20 years or so. I am currently in Washington State. In preparation to talk, I was trying to settle on a number in my mind as to how many days I have spent in the woods hunting. To the best of my knowledge, I came up with somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 days on the hunt. This would be inclusive of both small and large game, including waterfowl and 8 safaris. I am reasonably proficient in the disciplines of rifle, shotgun, and bow, and consider myself at this point in the game a decent tracker as well. I've seen a Bigfoot, but that's not why I really wanted to talk to you. I called about some evidence that I found and a little experiment that I did, in hopes of furthering the cause of Bigfoot being real. It's not that I need anyone to convince me, you understand. In the fall of 2006, while stalking some deer in the fringes of the Teton wilderness, I had a large Bigfoot pass above my position on a hillside while I was on the hunt below. As I said, I am not here to speak of this sighting because I frankly don't have much to say about it. I saw it, and it was the real deal, and that's it. What I do want to talk about is this subsequent bone pile that I came across, and my experimentation regarding it. In 2008, I was stalking in the area of Henry M. Jackson Wilderness, west of Chelan, when I came into the area that was devoid of, shall I say, all warm-blooded animals. It must have been for well over a mile before I realized that there was absolutely no creatures, be they great or small, to be found in this area, a fact that was extremely unusual in and of itself. A short time later, I came upon what I will describe as a small clearing which was scattered with the bones of just about everything that lives in these parts. I'm talking from skulls to legs and everything in between. Now, it's not that I stood there counting or anything like that, but there were so many bones from so many different animals that it would be impossible to determine what belonged to what. Just so you understand, if you were to shoot a deer in the woods and leave it be, in 6 months' time, there would be zero trace of an animal's body left. In fact, it is my opinion that the skull is the last thing to go, because that is virtually the only thing I ever find when hunting. Perhaps there is less marrow in the skull, but other than that, I really don't know why. Regardless, the fact that all these bones were here and there was no wildlife around really got my attention. I decided to do some experiments in the area over the next year or so. It was some 3 months later that I came to this area again and took down a deer about 2 miles away from this bone pile. Now, what I did was not right as it pertains to hunting, but this was an experiment, and for just this one time, I broke all the rules. I shot the deer and left it in the woods so that I could come back to it over time and log what happens to its carcass. I had seen a show about a place called the Body Farm many years ago. This is an outdoor forensics laboratory where human donor bodies were allowed to remain in various states outside in order to determine the rates of decomposition under a variety of circumstances. This study would then better enable law enforcement to determine the time of death for bodies found buried, lying in the woods, or even in the trunks of cars for that matter. Just so you guys know, you could look up the same documentary he's talking about if you go to YouTube and look up The Body Farm. As far as the deer was concerned, and my inability to come in here every day, I had determined that somewhere between 4 and 6 months was needed for this deer to vanish without so much as a trace. There was probably nothing left, and this had happened less than 2 miles away from the bone pile, which was still there and untouched. I must also mention that any hunter worth their salt will tell you that no predatory animal, be they bear, lion, wolf, fox, coyote, or anything else, will take their kill back to the same location over and over again. Whatever they don't eat will be eaten by something else fairly quickly. Having done my little experiment only 2 miles from the site of the bone pile, I went back and set up 3 game cameras in low and high positions near the pile and left them for a month. When I went back in and retrieved the cameras, not so much as one picture had been taken. I reset the area and came back a month later, finding 2 of the cameras missing and one smashed on the ground. It looked like it was hit from the front side with what I will describe as a punch. I say this because there was no damage, such as a rock or log would have done, to the plastic that was visible to my eyes. I took the camera home and disassembled it on my workbench in hopes of salvaging the card. Thankfully, the card was unaffected by the assault. When I reviewed the card, there were 2 pictures. In the first image, I saw what appeared to be dark fingers or a hand that must have come from the side into view, but it was very fuzzy. The second image was completely dark, as though the lens was facing or being held against something dark in color, and that was it. After having performed my experiments, my own personal conviction is this: the bone pile is a place where a Bigfoot is returning to over and over again, to eat. For what reason, I do not know. Secondly, the animals in the area surrounding this place will have nothing to do with this creature had touched, steering clear of the entire area for quite some distance. Again, the reason for this being a mystery at the time. It's also rather remarkable that as I came into the area for the first time, it was at about a mile away that all life was seemingly gone in the woods, and yet at 2 miles distance my deer had completely consumed. This made it clear to me that the Bigfoot's saliva on these bones, or something about it, had created a large barrier of some sort around its kill. At least one thing is clear in my mind now: nothing in the forest wants anything to do with Bigfoot. Within any other species, animals will contend for another's kill. If nothing else, they will return to get their fill of what another may have left behind. My wife Edna and I had started our hike from the Sead Valley and were working our way up north into the Rogue River, Siskiyou National Forest, our destination being the Red Buttes Wilderness area. Edna and I had been through this area many times and knew it probably better or as well as anyone on the planet. We had started early and made our way into what we refer as the Red Zone by noon. We were sitting side by side on a log with our backs to a tree line, facing a small field. We had been sitting quietly for about 20 minutes, taking our lunch break, when we heard something momentarily rustling behind us and off to our left in the trees. I turned my head to look and saw nothing. My wife had done the same thing as we continued to eat. I don't mean to sound like hearing something rustling is any big deal, as there is so much wildlife in here, but every noise does and should get your attention when hiking. The 2 of us have stumbled across many a bear and even a cougar during our many hikes. A few minutes later, as I was pulling my nasal inhaler out of my pocket, we heard what sounded like a loud crack, followed by the sound of a tree dragging on the ground. At least that's what I thought at the time. The 2 of us stood up from our seat on the log and turned to face the woods in the direction of the noise, with the trees being maybe 75 feet at best in front of us. From the position we were in, you couldn't really see into the trees to our left or to our right-hand side, but there was a small opening directly in front of us. We continued to look and listen as the sound of something dragging seemed to be getting closer and louder. Suddenly, a Bigfoot appeared from behind the trees to our right, walking into this opening and dragging a small tree in its right hand. As soon as it had made its way past the barrier of trees and into the opening, it turned its face to look at us and dropped the tree that was in its hand. Turning to the right, it slowly started to walk towards the rear of the opening, retreating back into the woods. It craned its neck, looking back at us as it walked away before it completely disappeared from view. I don't think it was but 5 minutes after we had seen it that we moved forward to where it had dropped the tree. Edna and I stood there looking at the tree. It was dead, but considerably large to be dragging around. It must have been easily 30 feet long and was about 6 inches in diameter at the base. Why this creature was dragging this particular tree and to where is anyone's guess. Our own thoughts being at the time that it couldn't have been planning to take it very far, or else it would have grabbed another tree nearer to that location. It must have been going to or living somewhere in close proximity to where we were standing. I'm sure that this Bigfoot was surprised to see us as we were to see it, perhaps even more so. I say this because we had a fair warning, having heard it coming. To me, there was absolutely no fear exhibited by the beast when I saw it, or having it seen us. Having seen the size of it, the reason why is more than evident. We had a more than perfect view of it for some 30 seconds or more, and when we walked over to the tree it had been dragging, there were several bows that we had watched it pass behind as it walked, all of which were in the neighborhood of 8 to 9 feet off the ground. This was one big mother, and I could tell you that. It appeared to be almost jet black with some red highlights that were shining in the sunlight as it broke into the small clearing. From the side, it seemed to be about 3 feet thick from front to back, and its fingers on the left hand were hanging just below knee level. One of the oddities about it was that the head looked tiny for the body. Now, don't get me wrong, the musculature was immense in every sense of the word, but even at that, the head seemed relatively small. We couldn't really make out any muscular definition other than that everywhere you looked, the body seemed to be bulging outward, such as the chest and the back. It was quite obviously built strongly to the extreme. It was casually walking, holding this tree in one hand that, even dead, had to weigh at least a couple 100 pounds or more, not including the bulkiness of it just being a 30-foot tree. The other thing about the sighting, which I can't forget, is the leisurely way in which, after it had seen us, it walked away. There was absolutely no sense of fear or urgency on its part after having seen us. I guess it knows that it could tear us limb from limb if it had to. And at any rate, that was our sighting, and we call it the Red Butte's Beast, as we named him. My friend and coworker, Roberto, and I were doing a 4-day hike through a national park in Virginia, and I won't name the national park. Along this Appalachian Trail, there are actually some accommodations in place for the wary hikers. Now remember, I'm really scared about what happened here, so I don't want people to come here and attract people to come and try to find a Bigfoot in this place. There are small, locked trailside cabins which can be reserved in advance, located in several locations. They contain bunks, mattresses, blankets, cooking utensils, and many other necessities. In addition, there are many 3-sided shelters in which there are bunks and outdoor fireplace for warmth and cooking. It is relative to one of these 3-sided structures that our story will unfold. Now, these 3-sided shelters are a shared commodity. In other words, if you are in there and a couple of other hikers come along to crash for the night, you are obligated to welcome them in and make the best of it. Everyone deserves shelter for the night, and it may be many miles before coming across another one on the trail. So Roberto and I, having planned to make it this certain shelter for the night, had arrived at this location, finding it already occupied by a husband and a wife. Having made all of our apologies for having nowhere else to crash for the night, they said that there are no apologies needed. In fact, they said, "We are rather happy that you came by because some strange happenings have been going on here, and we weren't looking forward to being here alone tonight." Naturally, the question arose, what exactly are the strange happenings in which you speak? Before I continue, let me say that these are in fact 3-sided shelters. They have a roof with 2 sides and a back, and one side being completely open to whoever and whatever may come along. We were, by the way, spending the night in the shelter by Loft Mountain. The couple went on to tell us that some 2 years ago, a group of 4 hikers was doing exactly what we were doing, just south of us in a shelter by Big Flat Mountain. Upon awaking in the morning, one of the group of 4 was no longer in the shelter. Her backpack was left behind. The couple went on to say that over a period of days, a large search had been undertaken for the missing girl that came up empty. It was some several weeks later, near the border of West Virginia, many miles away from the location of the disappearance, that a man walking through the woods came upon the body of the girl draped over the upper limb of a large tree, naked and having been partially dismembered. After they told us this story, I couldn't sleep a wink during the night. In the morning, as we got about the busyness of resuming our hike, my friend Roberto, who is a half-mad rebel from Central America, gets the boneheaded idea that we should go south and spend the night at the very shelter where this event had taken place, only 2 years ago. I told him he was out of his mind, but after much back and forth about it being a freaky thing to do, of this and that, I had succumbed to the plan, and off we went. Having arrived there, it was basically a duplicate of where we had been the last night. Only this night, he and I were alone. As the sun set and the evening turned into the night, I had basically been up for well over 24 hours, having not slept at all during the night. To be quite honest with you, I wasn't too keen on falling asleep there that night. It must have been around midnight when I looked at Roberto and he was sound asleep. This guy could fall asleep during a blizzard sitting on a curb, and yet I was still awake. It wasn't just that we had heard the story about what happened here, but to me there was most certainly some type of creepy residual aspect about being here. I was uncomfortable the entire night, feeling as though we were being watched very closely. By whom or what, I can't tell you, but I just couldn't shake it. Speaking for myself, the sun couldn't come up soon enough, and I was sorry that I had listened to Roberto's rant about wanting to come here. He was asleep, and I was being mentally tortured for the entire night in the shelter. Nothing had happened during the hike, and we commenced to finish our hike in the morning. The question which lingers to this day in my mind, and I would guess in the minds of many others, the question which was the reason for my contacting you in the first place, is this. Exactly who or what is capable of taking a human being many miles away, only to dismember them and put them up in a tree for safekeeping? That's what really blew my mind about this whole affair.
Are you ready for a bedtime story?
This story isn't mine, it's actually my dad's. Every other summer, him and a few of his friends go over to Maine and do some bass fishing. The encounter happened at around 2 to 3 in the morning. My dad got out of his tent because he had to take a piss. As he was draining himself, he heard a snap about 25 feet away. He looked up and saw nothing. To make sure it wasn't a predator, he shone his flashlight over in the general direction. The woods were really thick, so he really didn't see much at all, except for a pair of eyes. He really couldn't tell how high up off the ground they were, so, being the person he is, walked towards it. And as he did so, whatever the thing was ran away, and my dad got a better look at it. He says that it was around 8 feet and smelt pretty bad, like trash. He told his friends the next day, but they decided to stay the rest of the week due to the fact that my dad didn't feel that the Bigfoot wanted to hurt them, but was just more curious. He came home and told me, and now, a few years later, I'm telling you. I really hope that one day I could see what he saw so I can fully believe that this world is actually a strange one. I have had a lot of paranormal encounters, but this is not my story, this is my mother's. My mom and my uncle had to go pick up my grandmother. She worked in a small town called Red River, and the blizzard was so bad that my grandmother's car wasn't turning on. So she told my mom to pick her up and be safe because the roads were very slippery. My mom told my uncle to go with her, and they were at the Cuesta, New Mexico, and they drove slowly because the storm was so bad. While driving, a large creature started walking across the road. It was about 9 feet tall, and the creature had white fur and large teeth, and it just stared at my mother and uncle, and then it turned away and ran to the woods. They started talking about it, that they both agreed that it was a Bigfoot the next day, and my uncle went to the area, he found footprints and even took a picture of it. In the mountains of New Mexico, creepy stuff happens every day. It was the summer of 2015, and I was in 12th grade. Me and 2 other friends went on the camping trip in Alberta, Canada. The drive up was normal. We got to the campsite, and oh yeah, one of my friends, who we will call Jeff, brought his girlfriend, who we will call Jane. So when we pulled up to our camp spot, we unloaded our gear, then had lunch, and then we went on for a hike around 3 o'clock. We came back around 5:15, and for about 4 hours, we sat around the campfire telling stupid stories and other stuff like that. But this is when shit gets too real. We started to get the feeling we were being watched, which is weird because there was no one around us for about a whole kilometer. So we thought it just might be a fellow camper, so I yelled out, "Hey!" But no response. So we just ignored it. Later that night, I woke up to the sound of snapping twigs. I looked out of the tent curiously, and what I saw was a creature. About 20 meters away from the tent, it was about 8 feet tall with nut brown hair, and that's all I could really see in the moonlight. So I woke up my friend, and he went pale. He slowly closed the tent zipper and looked at me and said, "It's right outside." I told him that's impossible because it was just 20 meters away. To start out, my name is Doug, and my father and I are what you would call avid hunters, and we know what is in the woods where we hunt. Well, we took a trip to West Virginia to go black bear hunting. I was back at camp resting from an early morning bear hunt, and my father went out to go hunting for the afternoon, and I knew where he would be in case of emergence. Well, he gets to his spot and stays there till the sun sets, and then he starts to head back to the side-by-side he took out to get to his spot. On his way back, he heard footsteps, and remember, this is in the mountains where only hunters and rare locals know where they're at. The footsteps he heard were nothing human or bear, and he stopped for a second and kept walking, and then the most blood-curdling yet powerful yell came behind him, and he thought, so this is how it ends. Well, it will be a hell of a race. If he gets to the side-by-side, and as soon as he got in, something came running up at him and threw a giant rock at him. My father came back to the camp where I was waiting for him, and that was the first time I ever saw my father scared. He didn't come out of the camper until it was time to leave, and we left with no further incident whenever we returned. Let me start off with a few disclaimers. This isn't my story, it's a friend of my grandfather, and it's been a few years since I was told it, so the memory might be a bit hazy, and it may not be scary to most people, but I thought I would share it anyway. Also, if there are any mistakes in the story, I apologize. At the time of writing this, I was getting over a concussion. This story happened in Upstate New York. My grandfather's friend was hunting with one other person. For privacy reasons, I won't use any names of the people in this story. Anyway, they came across a road and decided to split up going in opposite directions on the road. He perched himself on a rock and waited till about 4 in the afternoon, but nothing showed. At this time, he decided to meet up with his friend. Right when he got off the rock he was sitting on, he saw something walking in the woods across a clearing not far from him. The thing walked out of the trees, and it had its right side facing him. He didn't know if it was a bear or a person, and he didn't know whether to talk to it or not. He then decided to whistle at it. The thing walked away from him on 2 legs, back into the forest. It disappeared from his sight. It then walked back out of the forest, this time facing him. They stared at each other before the thing walks back into the woods again and out of sight. My grandfather's friend walked back down the road away from the thing he saw, where he saw his friend walking up to him. He asked him if he had been down where he saw the creature. He said he never went down that way. To this day, he insists that it wasn't a bear because it would have stumbled on 2 legs, and he swears it wasn't a person because they would have alerted him of their presence. He insists that it was a Bigfoot. This is coming from a second-hand source, so you can judge on whether or not it's true, but I hope to find what he saw. What I'm about to tell you is very true. I've never told anyone in my life till now. This happened to me back in 2003 at our family farm in Ohio. It was mid-October, and my dad and I were on our way to the farm to deer hunt, as we always did every weekend. We arrived there around 5:45 in the morning. We sat in the truck talking and joking about who was going to see more deer or shoot the bigger buck like always. At about 5 till 6, we got out and got our gear on and headed towards the woods. As we entered the woods on the left side of the cow pasture, I noticed an odd, eerie feeling, which was normal for me, I guess, as the woods always gave me that feeling, even since I was young. My dad walked me to my tree stand and made sure I got in and situated safely. He told me good luck as always, and I said I'll be back at noon. He then proceeded to his stand. A few minutes after he left, this overwhelmingly tingle came over my body, as if someone or something was watching me. At this time, it was still dark. I began to look around the surrounding timber, trying to make out silhouettes, but couldn't. I was beginning to become very overwhelmed with that feeling of eyes upon me. A few minutes have passed since I scanned the timber last. I tried once more since my eyes have now adjusted to the dark better. I look off to my left and then slowly towards my right again, and nothing. I try to calm myself and mentally say, "It's nothing, you're fine." All of a sudden, I hear a crashing coming towards me from the left, and my heart sinks as I look. It was a few deer running for what appeared to be for their life. They blow through the woods and don't stop as I hear them still crashing through the timber. At this time, I am only able to make out silhouettes and outlines of trees. I thought that it was odd, but maybe a coyote or something was after them and just shrugged it off. Maybe 5 minutes later, it's still dark, but dawn approaches. I then feel the hair on my neck stand up, and that eerie feeling comes back upon me. My heart starts to pound profusely. I hear heavy crunching of leaves and loud snaps of sticks from the direction the deer had ran from, which was the neighbor's property. On the left side of our woods is 100 plus acres of switchgrass and hundreds of acres of other woods. I look up and see what appears to be my dad walking towards me. Daylight is starting to break now, but it's still pretty dark inside the woods. I wait till what I thought was my dad got about 20 yards plus from me, and I quietly say, "What are you doing, Dad?" No response. It just continues to walk towards me. So I say a little louder, "Dad, what are you doing?" And still no response. I begin to say, "Hey, you know you're trespassing, buddy." But no response. And as it got to the tree that my deer stand was in, I noticed that it was not my dad. I begin to freak out. I look across the woods to where my dad's tree stand is, and I see his flashlight climbing up the tree. And that's when I look down and seen this thing standing directly underneath my tree stand, looking dead at me. Whatever it was tall enough to reach up and grab my foot with ease. Mind you, I'm 14 feet up this tree. I began to start crying from fear, and my heart was beating so hard and fast I thought it was going to explode out of my chest. I let out a wimpy, muffled, "Ah!" yell. It just grumbled at me and walked off following the direction of the deer. I watched it disappear into the timber as the darkness was fading fast. Once it was gone, I was overwhelmed with this god-awful smell of body odor, mixed with the smell of death, old hound dog, and trash. As the morning went on, the woods was dead silent. Not a bird, squirrel, or deer, nothing. I've never heard the woods that quiet before, ever. Once I calmed down enough to climb down and out of my tree, I ran to my dad and told him I wanted to leave now, that I didn't feel well, so we left. This happened to me when I was 15. I'm now 29 and I've never hunted our woods in the morning again. I will not be there after dark to this day, and I still have not told anyone till now. I do not smoke, drink, or do drugs. Never have I promised. This is a 100% true story and the scariest thing that's ever happened. I was staying in a cabin on the border of Pennsylvania and Maryland in the mountains. One day we were snowed in, and when you're snowed up in there, you're stuck basically. Now, there are plenty of bears and deer up there. We kept salt licks, corn, and all kinds of stuff around. Not to hunt, but just to feed them. Well, I walk by the back window, which is over the underground garage, where we kept the snowmobiles and four-wheelers. I see this big brownish thing in the woods, probably 50 feet from the cabin, just sitting in the snow. I was shocked because I had never really seen a bear there, but heard the stories about them being around. So I ran to get my mom to show her, and as we walked back to the window, the damn thing stood up. And I don't mean like a bear. I mean like a big, tall man standing up. It then turned around and walked with a huge stride, and basically took off into the woods. We stood there shocked. What the hell was that? And my uncle just says, "Oh, that's a Squatch. He's a celebrity around here." I don't know if he was just trying to make us feel better by diffusing the situation with a comedic remark, but after that I never went to those woods alone again. That's my encounter. The woods by where my father grew up have an old abandoned house. Well, houses, I should say, scattered throughout the woods. I'm from the Hudson Valley. Anyone from that area knows the woods there have old houses, or at least the foundations remaining. Anyway, when my father was younger, he and everyone else basically would climb up this mountain to an abandoned house. He said it had an old black and white nudes, but a lot of kids would go up to smoke and hang out, so a lot of the things were just smashed. Part of the trip up the mountain basically involved climbing up a cliff, blanking on proper term, just a flat rock surface that you had to scale. This was also his usual way down, so one night he went up alone and was working his way down. Night was settling in, and as he was lowering himself down, the drop-off he felt had an odd presence and glanced upwards towards where he was just standing. Basically, what he saw was a quick glance because whatever it was just made him climb down the mountain and run home. He described it as basically very tall, lumbering above him and covered in hair. It wasn't a bear, at least from the glance he got. Normally, you'd take things to your parents and tell you have some doubt, but after a recent trip to his mother's and her sharing some of his stories that he told, it just made it more believable. There's also that whole you'll see what you want to see, so who knows. I'm terrified of heavily wooded areas, to be honest. I was on a 4-day canoeing trip with friends in a remote part of the southeast United States back when I was a young teen. We were up late, built a bonfire, and goofed off as young boys do. I'm sure we were making a lot of noise. Eventually the fire died down to just coals, and we just sat around it talking when we heard a distant, high-pitched scream. It freaked us out for a little bit, but eventually we forgot about it and went back to talking. A while later, one of my friends pointed to the opposite bank of the river and says, "Guys, what is that?" We looked, and standing there in the trees was a huge silhouette of some figure watching us. It was faint, but it was illuminated by the full moon, and it was huge. We just kind of stared at it in shock for a moment before backing away. We went to get our friend's dad and some flashlights. He was intent on showing us that nothing was there. We got back to the spot and it was still there, so we shined our flashlights on it, but it wasn't enough to get a better look. But the thing's eyes shone red with the reflection of our flashlights. We watched it watching us for a bit, and it walked up along an embankment, and then walked back and disappeared into the woods. That was more than a decade ago, and we rarely talk about it. We were all pretty freaked out. Finally, a chance for me to tell my story. About 10 years ago, my family and I were up in the White Mountains of Arizona to cut down our Christmas tree. My dad was driving our truck with my grandfather in the front seat, and my mom and sister in the back seat. I was in the bed of the truck, along with our family's German short-haired pointer. We were driving along a forest road, and all of a sudden, my dog starts barking and growling. So I look to see what it is, thinking it is maybe a bear or mountain lion. What I saw was a tall, dark figure walking parallel to the road just about 60 to 70 yards away. I yelled at my dad to stop the truck. When I told him I think I see Bigfoot, he just laughed and continued to drive. When I looked back to get another look at it, the figure had changed directions and was walking away from the road. The last thing I saw was the thing's head disappearing down a hill. To this day, I still do not have an explanation for what I saw, and every time the situation comes up, my dad always makes me tell everyone my story just so he could laugh. Didn't see anything, but heard. I lived in rural Massachusetts. To anyone who's familiar, that means miles of woodland with spaced out suburban areas in between. I was walking down my grandfather's logging trail, getting ready for his funeral. I'm also an avid mushroom collector, so I'm always walking slowly and staring at the ground. Friends hate me, basically. So I get to this cool little white-capped mushroom and stop to take a close-up picture of it. And that's when I heard it. The best way I can describe it is as if somebody with a lot of flesh on his knuckles were punching a tree. Now, I know what a deer sounds like when they stomp to protect their children and are smashing their antlers on trees. I've heard bear, fisher cat, moose, pretty much any animal in the western Massachusetts that exists. So, naturally, I looked up and freaked the hell out. It was so rhythmic. Thud, thud, thud. It went on for minutes at the same pace. So, being the curious person that I am, I let out a whistle that couldn't be mistaken for a bird. Right after my whistle, I hear a low, quick whistle back. My first thought is, oh, it must be some asshole logger scooping the land past the no trespassing gate. Ignorant, I know. So I yell out, "Hello?" pretty much as loudly as I could. Then, whatever it was, ran away faster than I've ever heard a human being run. And using my experience with deer, dogs, moose, and bear, I just assessed that I couldn't possibly rationalize it being a four-legged creature. I know that what they sound like running, and this was much closer to a two-legged creature. I'm 100% positive on that. What doesn't make sense, however, is that the two-legged creature that ran away from me, faster than any two-legged creature I have ever heard before, also sounded like it was at a minimum 250 pounds. The steps were loud and very frantic. A lot of people believe Bigfoot has a spiritual connection to the forest it remains in, and thus the creatures in it as well. I do not find it a coincidence that this happened the day of my grandfather's funeral. I ran all the way home, and I have never looked back. Okay, so I have a story that happened to me and my friends. To set the scene, we were on a Boy Scout camping shooting trip. There were 20 to 30 of us. We were in a little cabin thing with windows on the front and back, and a front and back door. There were wooden tables all around the area. The adult cabin was about an eighth of a mile down a gravel road in the dark. There was obviously a buddy system because it's Boy Scouts. So, it's around midnight and everyone had been telling scary stories, just like a normal camping trip. Well, I had to go to the bathroom and asked my friend to come along. He said sure, and he got our knives. We knew that there were bears in the woods and it made us feel safer. Well, we went to the bathroom and began our walk back. This is where it got scary. I felt an instinctual fear. I looked to my friend and he had the same look as me. We began to walk just a little bit faster and unfold our pocket knives. I then turn around and see it. It looked similar to a cat, but it was roughly 6 feet tall and was on its hind legs, kinda hunched over. I freaked the hell out and started running. My friend sees it too and we sprint back to the cabin. It began making a moaning, howling noise and followed us very closely. We pound on the door and the guys let us in. We tell them what we saw and they actually believed us. So we locked the front door and looked at the back door. It had no lock. We pushed a table up against it and had a kid there with his knife for safety. We draw the blinds on all the windows that had them. One of them didn't, and we sat there with all the lights on. Then we see the eyes outside of the windows without blinds. We are all shitting ourselves, and the thing slowly walked to the back door. We heard it bumping up against it, maybe trying to open it, we think. It then left, but we still thought we were going to die. No one slept that night. And when the adults came to wake us up, we told them, and they just laughed and said we were making it up. We know it happened, even if they didn't believe us. Not me, but my cousin. In the 80s, my cousin was on a camping trip with his wife. It wasn't a busy day for camping, and according to my cousin, the ranger told them that they were the only ones camping there that night. Anyway, so it's getting late, and my cousin said he spots something across the lake. He thought it was a bear standing, so he grabs his binoculars. It was sort of like a bear, but it was standing up on its hind legs. He said it wasn't a bear because it had a face, like a 70-year-old man, and the fur was longer than a bear. He thought maybe it was someone in a suit, but it disappeared quickly, whatever it was. He was so spooked and wanted to leave the park immediately. His wife thought he was being ridiculous, though, and just having an overactive imagination. She had brought a shotgun and insisted that they be fine if anything happened. Anyway, so that night everything is going fine until my cousin is awakened by footsteps. Now, his wife is still asleep at this point, but he doesn't want to wake her. He just tries to keep as still and quiet as possible. A figure approaches the tent. My cousin said he was positioned so that his head was on the corner of the tent. This figure leans down and gently presses its hand around the corner of the tent. So the figure is basically putting its hands around my cousin's head. I don't remember how long he said this lasted, but this figure eventually left. My cousin said it smelled like mechanical things, like someone working on a car, although he heard no car. Next morning, everything at the campsite was untouched. No problems at all. My cousin didn't mention anything about finding footprints. There wasn't any evidence that someone had been there. He eventually went and researched the area and discovered that their camping area is supposedly a hot spot for Bigfoots and such. He firmly believes that he saw some kind of Sasquatch. I'm not sure if I believe him. If anything, I always thought it was just a person messing with him. I actually have several other stories, but I didn't want to post to drag on, and I thought it would be too overwhelming. What convinced me was I saw it happen, and my cousin saw it with me. We were cruising through some rural areas in my cousin's car, and I want to say it was about 1 or 2 a.m. We weren't smoking or drinking, but just having a nice cruise. We went on this road that went through some heavy woods, but we did it before, so we had no fear. It was dark, of course, no moon, with just a slight sprinkle of rain. We were coming to this part in the woods where there was a street light, but it was an old light, and was starting to dim out. There used to be an old building there, but was torn down, but the light stayed up for a few years. Mind you, this was very rural, and no one lived nearby for maybe 20 miles, so it was extremely rare for you to pass another car, let alone another person at this time. It didn't help that the locals said, stay out of the woods at night. I was just looking out my window at the woods, and when we were coming up to the light, next thing I know, the car does a movie turn, like stomp on the brakes, do a 180, and freaking burn rubber the other way. I get weirded out and look back through the car, and I see the road illuminated by the streetlight, and I see this massive black figure beside the road. It takes one step, and it's in the middle of the road. Another step, and it's already on the other side. Immediately, I look forward, scared out of my mind, and look at my cousin, and I see the intense fear on his face. We don't say a word to each other, and he drops me off. I stay up till sunrise and finally go to sleep. Funny now that I think about it, we never talked about once, not after it happened, but yeah, we saw Bigfoot, and the locals do tell very similar stories. Last October, I was in California for roughly 11 days after my brother's wedding in San Diego. I just wanted to drive around the state and visit California places that had captured my imagination over the years, and I love driving almost as much as I love cars. I don't necessarily believe in Sasquatch, but I would never discount someone else's experience, especially if I wasn't there, so off I went. Clipper Mills is in the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas, about 70 miles northeast of Sacramento. Very near that dam was in the danger of failing last year. Pretty remote. So, after Bodega Bay, I head across the state for my destination, arriving near Sacramento in time for a late dinner. So it's after dark when I set out on the final leg. Very dark. It takes me a good while on all the twisty turning roads to find my way there. I wanted to get to the exact spot the person who posted the video parked that night. He wouldn't say in his video, so I poked around YouTube comment sections and related videos and found out more or less about the spot. Around 11 p.m., I pulled my rented Camry well off the dark two-lane road to avoid any issues with the very sparse traffic. I saw no one whatsoever, so I sat in the darkened interior, listening, allowing my eyes to dark adapt for about 20 minutes. I heard nothing but assorted insects as I sat there, saw nothing move at all. Eventually, not wanting to activate the car's interior lighting, I crawled out of the driver's side window into the black night, armed with my cell, with no service, a handheld GPS to find my way back should I get lost in the dark, and a red flashlight I use with my telescope. I stand there right by that car window for a solid 2 minutes before I could screw up the courage to move away from my Camry. Eventually, I walk up the road, still not hearing anything but bugs. Suddenly, without conscious decision to do so, I veer right and head up into the woods. My feet are crunching pine needles now, and to my mind, I sound like Bigfoot stomping around myself. After what was about 20 minutes, I stopped to listen and added to the insects I hear this faint screeching sound far off in the blackness. And it doesn't sound insect-like at all. It has more consciousness to it. The now also thoroughly dark adapted mind is whispering that it sounds like a person in distress, or a large primate. I remain still. I hear something small scurrying around in the underbrush as well, followed a minute later by that same forlorn-sounding wail, but now closer. Time to return to the car. As I'm walking back to the car, I hear this spooky sound, every 20 to 30 seconds, and now it is coming from behind me and in front of me. Shit. It seems to have a vocabulary of some sort to me now. Different vocalizations, some guttural, some high-pitched, and everywhere in between. My mind is having fun, just messing with me now. I was never so happy to see a Camry in all my life. I started it up before my ass was in the seat, I think, and half expected to see scores of red eyeballs glowing at me in the headlights from the dark forest in front of me. Now spooked, and my mind telling me some homicidal axe-wielding lunatic was nipping at my heels. I went back the way I came at much quicker pace than I had arrived. Out of nowhere, right in front of me, this black lab runs out of the woods on one side of the road and into the woods on the other. I barely missed crushing him. That scared the shit out of me right there. I slowed down a bit, and the thought of nearly mowing down an innocent mutt overcoming my mind. Some hour down the road towards Sacramento is when I noticed I had cell service again. I opened my Expedia app and found a nearby hotel for the night. Once safely enclosed in said hotel room, I began scouring the internet on my iPad and came to the conclusion that what I heard was a barred owl or a western screech owl. Can never be 100% sure, I suppose. Very creepy though, and I'm done with wandering alone in the woods at night. I think.